So we're going to start off, I want to show you a couple pictures before we get started here. Kathy's got them for me. Okay. And you can leave it there. And we'll notice that all these buildings have something wrong with them, right? They all seem to have the same something wrong with them, don't they? What's wrong with these buildings?
Foundation.
Foundation? What'd you say?
Built on sand.
Built on sand? The buildings look strong, don't they? I mean, none of them are crumbling. Did you see any of them falling apart? No. It isn't that they're cheap. The third one, if you go back one picture for me. That one there, that building there cost $3 million. And by the way, that building wasn't even open before that happened to it. So, if the building materials are not at fault, and they weren't built in a cheap manner, then what else remains? Okay, someone said foundation, right? Maybe it's the fault of the foundation. Maybe they didn't dig deep enough. But I'm pretty sure that each of these buildings were built on a pretty strong foundation. I mean, you don't get a weak foundation with $3 million, do you? Okay. Then what is left? What could possibly be the reason for the sinking tilt on every one of these buildings? The problem, I know I just turned on the mic, I remembered I had a microphone. The problem with these buildings isn't the quality of their materials. It may not even be the quality of their foundation. The issue with each of these buildings is where they chose to build their foundations. Has anyone been to Louisiana? Okay, there we go. I was hoping you'd be here. What is there a lot of in Louisiana? Sand? Water? Swamps, right? Okay. Well, who knows that it's not a good idea to build on a swamp? I know that, yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we should tell them, because that's where that building was built and that's why it sank. Clearly somebody missed the note, didn't they? The reason the building is sinking is because the swamp is never a good place to build a foundation. Jesus had a few things to say about foundations, didn't he? And so we'll turn over to the one that we probably are hopefully all thinking of right now. I know Tim's mentioned it as he's talking about the sand, right? Okay. Let's turn over to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, we'll start in verse 24. Matthew 7, 24. Matthew 7, 24. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the wind blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So what does Jesus tell us is a good place to build? What does he tell us is a good place to build on? Does he say, build your foundation on me, and then you'll weather the storm? You'll notice that he doesn't. I think that this is many times what we would like to hear. And I also think that many times this is what we are taught. But Jesus does not say the one who knows me is like the one wise man who built his house on the rock, does he? Instead, Jesus says the one who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The difference here is between knowing that we need a good foundation and then actually knowing what a good foundation is. Is it enough for me to know I need a good foundation to build a house if I don't know what materials make a good foundation? No, it doesn't. What if I thought, I need a good foundation. Maybe if I mix sand and water, it becomes kind of gooey, right? And if it's gooey, that means it's going to get stuck because it sticks on me. So that means that sand makes a good foundation when it's wet. If I don't know anything about my foundation, I can't build a good foundation. This is the difference between, this is what we're going to say, between knowing of Jesus and knowing who He is. We're thinking of the Pharisees. Knowing of God, think of the book of John. Jesus says, if you had known God, you would recognize me. The difference between knowing of God and actually knowing who God is. It doesn't matter how much your house costs or how much work you put into it. If on the day of the storm your house blows away and mine still stands, then it doesn't matter if mine's a little shanty and yours is a mansion. My house is more valuable than yours because mine's standing while yours is sinking. Right? Doesn't matter how great or how small the house is if it falls down in the end. Jesus says that His Word and the accomplishment of it are the solid rock which will hold us firm. Knowledge and wisdom, we need to hear, knowledge and wisdom are essential. It's not enough to simply say, I follow Jesus. We have to know who Jesus is in order to follow Him. Because, let's admit it here, there are a lot of people who say, I follow Jesus, they have no clue who Jesus is. And though therefore, are they really following Jesus? Can you be following a guide if you don't know where the guide is, and therefore you don't know where to go to find the guide? To be guided. Knowledge and wisdom are essential. And that is why teaching and learning are so important. That's why we're sitting here now, why I've spent so many hours on this to prepare this. Because it's important, right? I wouldn't do it if it wasn't important. I'd go and find a job somewhere else if it wasn't important. Teaching cannot be surface level. It cannot be easy. And we have no firm ground to stand on. On the other hand, we cannot become so focused on teaching and learning that we make no room for doing. Notice Jesus didn't say, the one who does not hear my words and does not do them is like a man who built his house on the sand. Both men heard the words of Jesus, but only one of them did what the words of Jesus said. So if we become so focused and stuck on, we have to teach and we have to learn and we have to grow, we have to learn and learn and learn and learn. Well, if you don't have any application for that learning, then what good is it? What does it matter if I know how to build a foundation if I never build one? I can be the best carpenter the world has ever seen. But what does it matter if I never use my hands to build anything? Without action, all knowledge and wisdom are useless. It doesn't matter if you know how to build a solid foundation, because if you do not apply the knowledge and actually build, it is all pointless. Sometimes in church we get ourselves in trouble by saying, well, I have Jesus. He is my foundation, and that's all I need. And so we say, okay, it's all right then for me to show up on Sunday, because all that's required is that I go to church. Because if I go to church, I got Jesus. And if I got Jesus, it's all I need. But if we don't have a relationship with Jesus, do we know Jesus? If I don't have you over to my house and spend time with you, do I know you? No. If the only time I get around you is to see you on Sunday mornings, do I know you? Why is Jesus any different, right? It takes a little bit more work than that. But the problem is, how can Jesus be our foundation, as we said, if we don't know who He is? How can He give us peace in the storm if we don't know what Jesus does? How can He be our shepherd and guide through our struggles of life if we don't recognize His voice? The issue is, if we don't know who Jesus is, then how can He be our foundation? Now, this doesn't mean we cannot ever know peace because we don't know Him perfectly. But it means that we should seek to know Him more every day, because the more we know Him and the better relationship we form with Him, and the more we interact with Him, the more we begin to learn about the depth of the peace that we are experiencing. And the better we are able to learn to take joy and pleasure and find contentment in those. That's where we how to experience His peace and blessing in a greater way every day. Let me give you some examples. This is all kind of talking about ideas now, but let's get some hard examples here. All right? One that has become prevalent, especially in the southern U.S. and in Latin America, is the health and wealth gospel. Right? I don't know if we're all familiar with that. But the health and wealth gospel says, if I am good, then good things will happen to me. If I am bad, then bad things will be happening to me. If I place my faith in Jesus, then He will make me healthy, wealthy, and wise. Okay. That basically sums up the health and wealth gospel. But what happens? What happens when you form this image of Jesus as your foundation? This is who Jesus is. Jesus is the one whom, when I trust in Him, He makes me rich, He makes me healthy, and He makes me very wise and knowledgeable. Okay. So what happens if this is who your Jesus is, and you do everything you're supposed to, then when you lift up your eyes to see what is happening, you look up and the world is crumbling around you. Doesn't that mean that your Jesus has failed you then? If that's who Jesus is, then Jesus has sure screwed up. But I thought this foundation was secure. I should not be declaring bankruptcy, but I should be moving into a bigger house and buying a boat. And that guy over there, he's definitely not a good guy. And you know what? Here he comes into his 10-car garage, and he's pulling a new boat. This doesn't make sense. Why is Jesus giving all that to him and not to me? Well, maybe because that's not who Jesus is. With this as our foundation, what happens when the world crumbles around us? Well, our foundation has crumbled as well. We have put God to the test and we have found Him coming up short. And if this is who I believe Jesus to be, and I believe that He has come up failing, then maybe my faith in Him was misplaced. Do we see the problem here? It's not enough to just say, I have Jesus, Jesus is my foundation, it's good enough. If we don't know who Jesus is and what Jesus does, then when our misunderstandings of who Jesus is and what He does comes crumbling around us, then more oftentimes than not, our faith is not far behind. When we do not know who Jesus is, what He said or what He does, then do we really know Him at all? And this is what begins to get to my main point today. When we experience, we've been talking about hardship, struggle, temptation, illness, when we experience any of these things in our families, in our own lives, or anything else, what is our expectation of God? What do we expect God to do in our lives when we are experiencing pain, hardship, illness, sickness, or temptation? What does God do? Because if we have a wrong understanding of who He is, and we put Him and expect something out of Him that God has never said that He is going to do, then what happens when our image of Him fails? Have we established a foundation that will fail us, or have we found one that will sustain us even through the greatest of storms? In order for us to make it through the hardest pains we will ever experience in life, we have to be able to understand and know not just that Jesus is there, what He is doing, and that He is getting us through it. If we don't understand how Jesus works, then how can we experience the peace and contentment that He brings in the midst of the storm? I was talking to someone this past week about this, and they told me that when they look at their life, they find comfort in the fact that it could be worse. There are people worse off than they are, and therefore they should count their blessings. The example they used was that of Hurricane Isaac and all the people that were suffering down there. Well, I know my life is bad, I know I'm having a hard time with this and that, but at least my home is standing around me. At least I'm not flooding. At least I'm not like them. I think that we many times do this as well, don't we? At least our children are better than theirs. At least I'm not like them. At least I haven't done this or that. Right? Our comfort is founded in, thank God I don't have it as bad as they have it. But there's two main problems I can see when we start to follow this path. First, do we ever find anywhere in the gospel that we should take comfort and peace because of someone else's misery? Because in reality, that is what we are doing. Jesus did not say, find comfort and joy when we see someone suffering. In Rather, he said we should mourn with those who mourn. But the second and the more important one, and the one we're talking about today, is this is a very brittle and fragile understanding of God. For some of us, that foundation might just hold. That foundation might just hold. At least I'm better than this person. At least I'm not as bad off as they are. Because for some of us, it'll never get as bad as that. But how many of us know how deep and how painful our future pain and sufferings are going to be? Do any of us? I don't. Do you know that in every single race, somebody has to come in last? When you finish last, that means, can you look back and say, well, at least I beat that guy? Can you look back and say, I'm blessed, I did better than them? So now, where will you find your peace and rest? Now, how can you be comforted and restored if your peace and rest is founded on, at least I'm not as bad as they are? Your foundation has failed you, and therefore the possibility creeps on that maybe your God has failed you. And if our God is understood on the false pretense, then He will always seem to fail us. We need to understand it. If we understand God in a way that He is not, He will always fall short of our expectations. Okay? If we understand God to be someone who He is not, then He will always fail to be who we understand Him to be. God is God, and we cannot change that. And we cannot put Him to the test and say, God is this, and therefore He will do this for me, because we'll always find ourselves falling short, won't we? What happens if one day, when everything collapses, you look around, and you can't even find one person who's worse off than you? Where is your blessing now? And then soon it becomes, where is your faith now? This is why it is so very important to not just have Jesus as our foundation, but to have a growing, notice that we're not going to have a complete, but a growing understanding of who Jesus is, and a life lived accordingly as our foundation. Let me ask you, does God ever promise to remove hardship, temptation, suffering, whatever that might be? Does He promise that He will ever heal an ailment? Does He promise that He will remove every temptation? Well, absolutely not. Now, that does not mean that God does not heal. God does heal. We see that, don't we? Okay? God does remove temptation. God does level our way. Many times, but He never says He will always do these things, does He? More times than we know, He does. But our faith cannot be built on a foundation that God will do whatever I determine is good, because if He doesn't, then He has failed. And this is putting God to the test, and turning Him into a great power, and turning Him not to a great powerful king, but turning Him into a puppet with strings to be pulled and prayers to be prayed. If I do this, then this will happen. If I do this, then that will happen. God doesn't work that way, does He? Now, the temptation as we're talking about this is, well then, what can I expect from God? Getting back to our original question. When we experience hardship, suffering, temptation, whatever that may be, what can I expect of God then? Is there any hope at all? Well, this is where we might have dismantled some foundations, but we need to build a very firm, solid one. God has given some very sure and eternally perfect promises. Promises that we can count on without exception, every single time. And these are the ones that we need to build our foundation upon. And these are not just a matter of one day I'll be saved, but these are a matter of, like David said, I believe that I will see you in your presence in the day, in the land of the living, right? Today. So turn over with me to Philippians chapter 4. Sorry, Philippians doesn't have 10 chapters. Philippians chapter 4, starting in verse 10. Philippians 4, verse 10 through 13. Philippians 4, verse 10 through 13. I rejoice in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Now, do you know when it was that Paul wrote this? Do you know where he was at? What? Prison. In the very beginning of Philippians, he tells us that he is in prison. In the midst of being in prison, Paul writes, I've learned to be content in every situation. This would sure be an easy passage to write while you're being lifted high, right? Okay. When I'm getting my Christmas bonus, expecting my first child, when I win the lottery, right? It's pretty easy in that moment to say, I've learned to be content in all situations. I was content when things were low and when things were high, right? But Paul doesn't write this when he's on a high. He writes it during a low. He writes it when he's declared bankruptcy, when his sister has died, when my friends have abandoned me, when my spouse is wanting a divorce. That's the moment, that low moment is when Paul wrote and said, I've learned to be content in every situation. Now in that moment, when you get to that day, I don't want to say let me see you, I want to say let me see me. Can I take pen and paper and write, I have learned to be content in every circumstance? Because I'm telling you, it's probably not very likely. Verse 13 is another one of those verses which has been used as a foundation in the very wrong way, in a very wrong manner. It is a good foundation. It's a very, very good foundation, but only if you use it properly. It's like a bag of cement. If I throw a bag of cement down and say, I'm going to build my house on this, if I don't ever mix the cement, is it a good foundation? It's not. It might be a good foundation if I use it properly, but, right? Paul does not say anything close to, if I put my mind to something, Christ will enable me to do it. He does not say anything close to, anything I do for Christ, God will give me success. It does not say anything close to, Christ will enable me to be free of any hardship, pain, and suffering. Rather, what it says is that no matter what situation I find myself in, no matter what height or depth, no matter if I finish first or last, no matter if I place my hope and faith in Christ, what does it say? I will be able to get through any and every circumstance. He will enable me to survive, and He will give me the ability to have contentment in the midst of the depths and the hardships. Our foundation cannot be built on false pretense, or else it will be bound to fail. It is not God who is failing, but it is our lack of knowledge of who He is that is failing. So let this be our foundation as we experience day-to-day life. Let us understand and begin here. Romans 8:28 reads, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for the good of those who are called according to His purpose. Does it say there will be no temptation? Does it say there will be no hardship? Does it say there will be no suffering? Does it say there will be no pain, no illness, no loss? It does not. But what it does promise is when those things happen, and they will happen, won't they? It promises that God will work every pain, suffering, hardship, loss, illness. He will take those seemingly meaningless sufferings, and He will accomplish something through them. That means that we do not find faith and content in the fact that it could be worse, because it might just get worse. We don't find faith and peace in the belief that if I have enough faith, God will take it away. It does not mean that if I do the right thing, God will bless me with joys, absent of sorrow. What it means is that when life happens, when we are imprisoned, when we suffer loss, when our children embarrass us, when money comes up short, that if we place our hope in Christ, if we focus our vision on Him, then He will give us peace no matter how great the suffering. That is a sure promise that God has given to us. That He will guide us through in the midst of the pain. That He will take our situation that is evil. Do not be hesitant to name pain and suffering as evil. It is evil. He will take our situation that is evil and was meant for nothing but evil, and He will redeem it, redeem us, and use it to accomplish something great. This is where we must build our foundation. This is where our understanding of what does Jesus do when we're experiencing suffering must begin. If we do not seek to understand and know what it is that God does, then our faith will be tested, and our foundation will inevitably fail us. God has promised to hold us upright and to keep us firm throughout it all. And we must believe and hold on to this hope. It is then that we will come out the other side, beat up and bruised, but the stronger for it. God does not wish us to suffer, ever. But He does promise that when we do suffer, He will never allow it to be for nothing. One of the most emptying things we can experience is when we go through hardship, pain, suffering, or go through a lot of work, right? Spend a lot of money just to watch it be for nothing. One of the most frustrating things, right, is when you buy let's say a new refrigerator, right? And you drive down the road and it falls off and falls in the lake. Well, what good is that refrigerator? You're not getting your money back. You just worked for how long just to lose it? That is a pointless loss. Right? Death, suffering, hardship, illness. If we do not have the firm foundation of who Christ is and what He does, can feel like we believe to be pointless, non-productive sufferings. How does the world deal with loss? I had a friend at school ask me that once. He says, I don't understand how the world could ever deal with death. Because there's no meaning to it. There's no purpose behind it. There's no success in it. How could the world ever deal with it? Well, God has promised us that He will never allow anything that we go through to be for nothing. When we hope in Christ, there is no such thing as meaningless suffering. It's not that God takes away our suffering, but He gives meaning to it. We have this promise to hold on to, this foundation to keep us secure. God has promised if we trust in Him, He will guide us through it, and He will not allow any of it to be for nothing.